So today we're going to go see this movie, Reagan. I'm guessing it's going to be about Ronald Reagan. But we'll find out. You know, this is kind of a funny movie to do this with because the expected audience for this Reagan movie, compared to some other movies I've seen in the past week, is like very small. It would have made a lot more sense for me to do this with Alien Romulus. I saw a sneak preview of Slingshot the other night. Blink Twice. There's some interesting things to talk about. So maybe I should circle back to, some of these other recent movies that someone watching this is more likely to go see. But I'm intrigued by this Reagan movie. It's new. I think there's a chance that I have a couple family members that will be interested in this movie and want to see it, but probably for different reasons than I have. In the video I made the other day about the word weird as it's applied to J.D. Vance, in the opening of the video I used this term political propaganda, and I didn't really develop that theme, that idea, that point in the video that I made. I guess I talked about weird being intentionally deployed, which, you can sort of extrapolate from that. But it's going to be interesting to, sort of critically examine a movie called Reagan, because I'm going into it not knowing sort of the motivations, the angles, the political beliefs of the filmmakers. I don't know who directed it. I don't know what studio is putting it out. I'm going to be honest. I'm guessing there's maybe sort of a kind of like a Sound of Freedom type right-wing vibe, maybe, to the studio putting it out. Maybe I'll have more things to say after I see it about sort of the emergence of this polarity, in certain segments of sort of cinema in terms of the films that get released. It's a Thursday. This movie just came out. I'm going to see the 2 p.m. showing, which is the first showing at my local theater. It might also be interesting to note who else is getting out real early for this Reagan experience. So we'll see. I'll have some thoughts probably when I get out. Jump cut. One thing that's nice about filming yourself, just living your life like this, is it forces one to be a little bit more deliberate. Even if I'm doing something trivial like seeing a film, by making it a part of this whatever, I'm kind of committed to going in there and thinking critically about it and having sensible takes. Not that I wouldn't otherwise, but by preconceiving it, going in there, doing it, processing my thoughts afterwards, I imagine I will take more away from this experience than I would otherwise. Jump cut.
I now begin the journey that will lead me into the sunset of my life. I know that for America, there will always be a bright, new dawn ahead. Thank you, my friends. May God always bless you. Sincerely, Ronald Reagan.
Okay, so I saw this movie, Reagan. What are my initial thoughts? One of my first thoughts is that this film struggles. This film has a similar structural problem to a lot of biopics, in that in attempting to sort of tell the full story of a character, sort of dramatic and thematic structure is sacrificed, right? So sometimes I think the most successful kind of biographical films are those that zoom in, right, at a particular episode in a historical figure's life, and really allow that to be sort of thematically or structurally analogous to the larger story of the person as a whole, if that makes sense. Two examples that come to mind are the film Steve Jobs and the film 13 Days. Steve Jobs is a movie that chooses three sort of parallel, structurally similar episodes, 3 moments, 3 days, and they're even less than a day. It's basically like 3-hour-long segments of Steve Jobs' life taken from different points during his career. And there's like a stronger structural cohesion, integrity to those individual moments, and then they as a whole and individually speak to sort of the larger mythos of Steve Jobs. Right? 13 Days, about the Cuban Missile Crisis, isn't purporting to be a full biography of John F. Kennedy, but it is sort of a biographical look at this man through the lens of one particular and therefore sort of narratively and thematically contained crisis. And Reagan isn't trying to do this. Reagan is going the other route. Reagan is giving us the full sort of image of the political man, as it were. But we go back to earlier episodes in his life before he's, involved in politics. The framing of this film is interesting, though. Even though the sort of like macro view picture of a life isn't interesting, this movie chooses to present Ronald Reagan through a frame narrative of 2 contemporary Soviet men, Russian men, having a conversation about the legend that is Ronald Reagan, which is a really interesting way for this movie to kind of both sidestep and like lean into the problems of sort of dealing with both the myth of Ronald Reagan and the reality of the man. I would have been probably more interested in a biographical angle that zoomed in a little more closely on Ronald Reagan and his personal beliefs and had a little bit more of a critical lens about his motivations, and, sort of what he was all about. And this movie clearly is interested in the myth, the legend of Ronald Reagan. And it would probably be awkward and sort of like, overtly propaganda-ish if they did this without the Russian framing narrative. But by setting up the film as basically a conversation between 2 Russian guys who are trying to understand the reality of how this man sent from God toppled their Soviet empire, it kind of puts us at one step of remove, and it obfuscates a little bit the reality of who's telling this story and why they're framing it the way that they are. So what we end up with is a sort of macro view of the political life of Ronald Reagan, life and career of Ronald Reagan, as framed from sort of this classic American sort of straw manning of, the Soviets. These Russians who looked strong but were really always weak, and in their quiet conversations when the cameras aren't around, what they're talking about is how badass Ronald Reagan was, right? That's sort of the take. So you can see that because that is sort of the structural approach, you can probably imagine that thematically this movie is going to be most interested in Ronald Reagan, sort of the anti-Soviet demagogue hero. And that kind of is the take. And maybe a little bit later I'll get into some ways in which they try and sort of sand down the potentially problematic edges of Ronald Reagan. For instance, there's a scene earlier in the film when Ronald Reagan is the president of or maybe the vice president of the Screen Actors Guild, and he's giving a speech in which he says that, democracy is strong enough to withstand people with communist beliefs. Basically they're framing Ronald Reagan as being okay with people being communist because we need maybe a way to proactively push back against maybe concerns, criticisms, complaints that Ronald Reagan's participation in the Red Scare era of politics was sort of net bad and unforgivable. But there's some attempt made to sort of paint him over as like, he is not really out to get these folks. He knows America can handle it. The film does this sanding in other ways too. For instance, Ronald Reagan's first wife, his first marriage, the dissolution of that marriage is framed entirely as sort of this like God-sent unavoidable tragedy. The growing distance between him and his wife is, posited through the, technique of montage as being almost sort of like a direct result of the loss of their third child. We don't actually discuss the divorce itself. We just see the estrangement. We see the death of the child. And then before we know it, Nancy's coming in, and we got wife number 2 on the scene. I want to say now, I think the most significant or maybe interesting thing about this film to me was that if it is propaganda, right, if that is the right thing to call it, it's not really political propaganda, it's religious propaganda. This movie is entirely framed as part of a universe in which God has a plan, and God is sort of the ultimate power to which we must defer. Sort of throughout the film, at critical decision points, at crisis points in his life, Ronald Reagan is both reminded by other characters, typically female characters, his mother, his wife, but then sometimes by himself, that he's doing what he's doing for God. There's a line, I took a note about it, but this is a pretty close paraphrase. His mom says early on in the film, "Don't forget whose you are," right? And who you're doing this for. And whose you are is really interesting because it's so close to "don't forget who you are," which is a very sort of like non-religious, just sort of motivational thing. You know, there's some Mufasa shit, you know, remember who you are. But this is remember whose you are, right? And this sort of ceiling of God, or this sort of power structure in which God is the ultimate determinant, is reiterated throughout the film. Another thing that jumped out to me in this film is that there's a religious figure in the film who's played by, I forget this guy's name. I think he played Hercules in like the old TV series, and I think he's the director of the film God's Not Dead, which was a pretty big religious sort of film hit. So when he shows up in the movie, it's a little bit of like a signal maybe. And maybe this is unfair of me to assume this, but it feels like a little bit of a signal as to maybe some of the deeper things that this movie's about, i.e. God. You know, and this God framing is a little bit subtle, I suppose, even though it's definitely there and it's definitely consistent throughout the film. But if we were to generally summarize this film in terms of its sort of structure of conflict and theming, this is a movie about Ronald Reagan having to believe in himself and what God wants him to do, which is to dismantle the Soviet Union. So we have an ultimate sort of climax of the film, which is the tear down this wall speech, right? Which is pretty close to the end of Ronald Reagan's political career. And we get a little bit of a coda of him on the ranch and acknowledging his Alzheimer's, and sort of then he rides off into the sunset, I kid you not, to the song Country Roads. I was a little disappointed, honestly, after how this film opened, because the film opens with the attempted assassination of Ronald Reagan, which was not long after his first election into office. And it became very clear to me at that moment in the theater that there were some things this movie has going for it that are just coincidentally like really prescient, right? This idea of an attempted assassination, the idea of a well-liked but elderly leader who seems to, at certain points, maybe clearly be losing his faculties, and this idea of Russia as this big bugbear that, is intentionally chosen as the center point of sort of international political rhetoric and propaganda. Right? I mean, these are things that we've been dealing with in this current year of 2024, right? An attempted assassination, the looming specter, but I don't know if it's really there, right, of Russia. And then what happens with elderly leaders when they maybe aren't mentally fit to lead anymore. But the movie isn't really interested in Ronald Reagan losing his faculties. It's sort of just like a bittersweet coda to the film. And if anything, he's sort of positioned as someone who like recognized that he was fading and gracefully rode into the sunset again to an elongated performance of Country Roads. And even though the film returns to the assassination at the midpoint, which is structurally nice that we open with this and then we build back to it at the center point of the film, and it doesn't really capitalize on anything related to the assassination. It isn't treated as a moment that sort of convinced Ronald Reagan to like dig in and like really fight those Soviets. It isn't even framed as sort of like a wake-up moment of, do you really want to keep doing this political thing if your life is on the line? It's sort of just in there because it has to be in there, and because he has some funny quips, you know, in the operating room. So a little bit of a letdown there. You know, Dennis Quaid is pretty good. I like Jon Voight as this sort of entertaining, but almost kind of also like preposterous, sort of Russian narrator. Some of the things he says. At one point he shouts, the motherland isn't communism. The motherland is them. Chekhov, Tolstoy, Dostoevsky. The motherland is here. And he like beats his chest. It's just like, it's funny to me in a movie called Reagan to like think about the dialogue that these American writers are putting into the mouths of these Russian characters who are just so in awe of Ronald Reagan. It's just like everyone was, because he was just the best. But the performances are pretty good. The movie's too long. Like I said, it's a little bit unfocused. I mean, I think for people who are coming to this movie to consume it as just sort of like a celebration of Ronald Reagan, it's going to work that way for you. But for those who, are looking for a compelling film with like stakes and drama, with thematic resonance, with some sort of like structural approach that is in service of, a compelling narrative, you're probably going to be a little disappointed. But disappointed in the same way that you might be about, I don't know, Bohemian Rhapsody or Rocket Man. This film has the same challenges that any sort of laudatory film about a biographical subject has. The much more interesting film would be the film that began with an antagonistic approach to Ronald Reagan, right? A film that attempted to look for some complexity, some sort of unresolved tensions, some tragic problems, you know what I mean, to this man's life and his outlook. But it isn't going for that. It's a celebration, and if you come to it wanting that, then you're probably going to be happy. If you come to it looking for anything new or critical about this guy or his, political career, you're probably going to be disappointed. If you like horses and the song Country Roads, it's a must-see. Jump cut.
There are no cats in America, and the streets are filled with cheese.